Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. PR.AA-03, Authenticating Users and Devices. PR.AA-03 ensures that organizations establish and enforce authentication mechanisms for both users and devices to protect networks, systems, and sensitive data from unauthorized access. This subcategory belongs to the Protect function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that strong authentication policies must be implemented to verify the legitimacy of all users and devices before granting access to critical systems. Without proper authentication controls, organizations risk identity impersonation, unauthorized system access, and increased exposure to credential theft, man-in-the-middle attacks, and malware infections. By implementing robust authentication mechanisms, organizations ensure that only authorized users and trusted devices gain access to enterprise resources, reducing the risk of security breaches and account compromise. A structured authentication framework enables organizations to enforce multifactor authentication, integrate risk-based authentication models, and adopt device attestation methods to validate endpoint security. Organizations that deploy centralized identity authentication platforms, enforce strict access policies, and integrate AI-driven authentication anomaly detection improve their ability to prevent unauthorized access, detect suspicious login attempts, and strengthen overall cybersecurity resilience. Multiple stakeholders play a role in authenticating users and devices. Identity and access management (IAM) teams and security administrators are responsible for configuring authentication controls, enforcing authentication policies, and monitoring authentication security risks. Business executives and compliance officers ensure that authentication mechanisms align with regulatory requirements, corporate security policies, and industry authentication standards. End users, including employees, contractors, and third-party service providers, must follow authentication security best practices such as using strong credentials, enabling multi-factor authentication, and avoiding credential reuse across different platforms. Authentication for users and devices is implemented through multi-factor authentication, MFA, passwordless authentication models, certificate-based device verification, and risk-based authentication frameworks. This includes enforcing biometric authentication for high-risk access, deploying hardware security keys for privileged accounts, and integrating behavioral authentication for continuous identity validation. Organizations that fail to implement structured authentication controls risk increased credential theft, unauthorized remote access incidents, and identity-based cyber attacks. Several key terms define authentication for users and devices and its role in cybersecurity governance. Multifactor authentication, MFA, ensures that organizations require at least 2 authentication factors such as passwords, biometrics, or security tokens to verify user identities and reduce unauthorized access risks. Device trust verification ensures that organizations validate endpoint security posture before granting access, preventing compromised devices from connecting to enterprise networks. Risk-based authentication, RBA, ensures that organizations dynamically adjust authentication requirements based on contextual factors such as device reputation, geographic location, and login behavior anomalies. Passwordless authentication ensures that organizations reduce reliance on passwords by implementing biometrics, smart cards, or FIDO security keys for stronger authentication security. Identity Federation and Single Sign-On (SSO) ensure that organizations streamline authentication across multiple applications while maintaining strong access security. Challenges in authenticating users and devices often lead to weak access security, increased credential-based attacks, and operational inefficiencies in managing authentication policies. One common issue is over-reliance on password-based authentication, where organizations fail to implement multifactor authentication, increasing the risk of credential theft and brute force attacks. Another issue is lack of device trust validation, where organizations authenticate users but do not assess device security posture, allowing compromised endpoints to access corporate networks. Some organizations mistakenly believe that single sign-on (SSO) alone provides sufficient authentication security without recognizing that additional identity verification measures such as risk-based authentication and device attestation are necessary for robust security. When organizations implement structured authentication frameworks for users and devices, they enhance security posture, reduce unauthorized access risks, and ensure authentication security remains adaptive to evolving cyber threats. A structured authentication security model ensures that cybersecurity teams monitor authentication risks proactively, business leadership aligns authentication strategies with enterprise security objectives, and security teams integrate authentication improvements into ongoing cybersecurity governance initiatives. Organizations that adopt AI-driven authentication analytics, enforce biometric and hardware-backed authentication models, and integrate real-time authentication risk modeling into cybersecurity governance develop a comprehensive authentication security strategy that strengthens resilience against identity-based cyber threats. Organizations that fail to authenticate users and devices effectively face severe security, operational, and compliance risks. Without strong authentication mechanisms, businesses risk credential theft, unauthorized access to sensitive systems, and identity impersonation attacks, leading to potential data breaches and operational disruptions. A common issue is reliance on single-factor authentication, where organizations allow password-only authentication without implementing multifactor authentication (MFA), making accounts more vulnerable to phishing, brute force attacks, and credential stuffing. Another major challenge is failure to enforce device authentication, where organizations authenticate users but do not verify the security posture of the devices they use, increasing exposure to malware-infected or unauthorized endpoints. By implementing structured authentication policies for users and devices, organizations ensure that access to critical resources remains restricted to authorized users. Authentication controls adapt to emerging threats, and device security remains a fundamental requirement for network access. A well-defined authentication security framework prevents unauthorized access attempts, ensures compliance with regulatory mandates, and strengthens organizational cybersecurity posture. Organizations that deploy centralized authentication platforms, enforce hardware-backed authentication methods, and integrate continuous authentication risk assessments improve their ability to prevent account takeovers, detect anomalous login behaviors, and enhance access security dynamically. At the partial tier, organizations lack structured authentication frameworks, leading to weak authentication controls, inconsistent device security enforcement, and high susceptibility to credential-based cyber attacks. Authentication is handled reactively, with organizations only implementing stronger authentication controls after experiencing security incidents. A small business at this level may allow employees to log in using weak passwords without enforcing MFA, making accounts vulnerable to phishing and credential theft. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured authentication policies, ensuring that user access mechanisms align with security best practices. However, authentication governance may still be limited, with inconsistent implementation of MFA and device trust verification across different business units. A mid-size healthcare organization at this level may require two-factor authentication for patient record access, but fail to enforce device authentication policies, allowing unverified personal devices to access medical systems. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured authentication framework, ensuring that authentication methods, access control mechanisms, and identity verification policies are enforced consistently across all enterprise systems. Authentication governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing authentication policies, enforcing access security standards, and tracking authentication effectiveness. A multinational financial institution at this stage may deploy biometric authentication and hardware security keys for all employees handling sensitive financial transactions, ensuring that credential theft risks are minimized. At the adapted tier, organizations employ AI-driven authentication analytics, behavioral authentication models, and zero-trust identity verification architectures to dynamically assess authentication risks and continuously refine access security policies. Authentication security is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that organizations detect and mitigate authentication-based threats in real time. A global cloud service provider at this level may use AI-powered risk scoring to analyze authentication patterns, dynamically enforce adaptive authentication challenges, and block suspicious access attempts automatically. Authenticating users and devices aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured authentication security models and proactive identity risk mitigation strategies. One key control is IA-7, Cryptographic Module Authentication, which requires organizations to authenticate users and devices using cryptographically secure methods, such as certificate-based authentication or hardware security modules. A multinational defense contractor implementing this control may require cryptographic authentication for all remote access sessions, ensuring that unauthorized users and compromised devices cannot connect to classified systems. Another key control is AC-10, Concurrent Session Control, which mandates that organizations restrict the number of concurrent active sessions per user, reducing the risk of credential theft and unauthorized account sharing. A global financial institution implementing this control may enforce session-based authentication policies that automatically terminate inactive sessions and prevent simultaneous logins from multiple locations to detect and block compromised credentials. Authenticating users and devices also aligns with IA-5 Authenticator Management, which requires organizations to manage, secure, and periodically update authentication mechanisms to ensure that credentials remain protected from compromise. This control ensures that organizations enforce strong password policies, integrate cryptographic authentication methods, and revoke credentials that are no longer needed to minimize security risks. A multinational healthcare organization implementing this control may require periodic credential rotation for all privileged accounts while enforcing passwordless authentication for patient portal access to reduce reliance on static passwords. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic authentication security measures, ensuring that employees must use multifactor authentication, MFA, for critical business applications, while restricting access from untrusted devices. A large enterprise may deploy AI-driven authentication risk assessments, zero-trust identity models, and adaptive authentication enforcement to ensure that all user and device authentication processes remain dynamic and threat-aware. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as finance, government, and healthcare may require legally mandated authentication audits, biometric authentication policies, and compliance-driven identity verification reviews to ensure that authentication security aligns with industry best practices. Auditors assess an organization's ability to authenticate users and devices by reviewing whether structured, documented, and continuously enforced authentication governance frameworks are in place. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured authentication risk models, enforce real-time access security policies, and integrate predictive authentication analytics into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. If an organization fails to authenticate users and devices effectively, auditors may issue findings, highlighting gaps in authentication policy enforcement, weak alignment between identity verification processes and risk management policies, and failure to integrate structured authentication controls into cybersecurity governance framework. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Authentication access logs and structured credential issuance documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce authentication security policies. Privileged access request logs and authentication failure reports provide insights into whether organizations proactively assess and mitigate authentication security risks through structured access control monitoring frameworks. Automated authentication validation reports and predictive access analytics show whether organizations effectively track, monitor, and enhance authentication security using real-world identity risk assessments and adaptive authentication models. A compliance success scenario could involve a global technology company that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that authentication security strategies are fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that authentication risks are continuously monitored, credential security remains dynamic, and authentication policies are enforced consistently across the organization. Auditors confirm that authentication governance policies are systematically enforced, authentication monitoring mechanisms are dynamically adjusted based on risk exposure, and enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance frameworks align with structured authentication security requirements. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured authentication security frameworks, neglects dynamic authentication risk validation, or lacks formalized privileged access authentication workflows may receive audit findings for poor credential security, weak access governance, and failure to align authentication security strategies with regulatory compliance mandates. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that authentication security strategies for users and devices remain continuous and effective. One major challenge is lack of automation in authentication security enforcement, where organizations fail to implement real-time authentication governance tools, leading to outdated or incomplete identity verification policies. Another challenge is failure to align authentication security policies with evolving cyber threats, where organizations do not update authentication enforcement strategies based on new attack techniques, increasing exposure to credential-based cyber attacks. A final challenge is over-reliance on static authentication mechanisms, where organizations fail to integrate AI-driven authentication risk detection, behavioral biometrics, or dynamic authentication challenge response models, limiting their ability to detect and prevent sophisticated authentication threats. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured authentication security frameworks, ensuring that authentication validation strategies remain continuously optimized, and integrating real-time identity verification models into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. Investing in automated authentication enforcement platforms, predictive authentication risk analytics, and AI-driven access control monitoring solutions ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine authentication security strategies in real time. Standardizing authentication governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that authentication security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to authentication security risks and strengthening enterprise-wide access control resilience. By embedding authentication security strategies into enterprise cybersecurity governance frameworks, organizations enhance authentication risk awareness, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable authentication validation processes across evolving cyber risk landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.